Mr Speaker.
Andrew Bailey.
Thank you. Mr Speaker, it's a pleasure to talk on this bill tonight. Rather strangely named, I may have to say, the Keep Kiwibank bill. Mr Speaker, to me this is one of those topics that is very appealing in a conceptual way, but when you start to look inside the technicalities of it, I think it starts to fall apart a little bit.
A little bit.
For instance, this whole issue about making sure you retain ownership of Kiwibank, you have to ask yourself what does actually constitute a sale. And so just to give you some examples of what I mean about that, what happens when the directors of New Zealand Post legitimately want to raise cash through the form of issuing new equity to fund an expansion of, for instance, Kiwibank's operations itself, or maybe other operations within the New Zealand Post? Well, that's one example. Secondly, does raising equity to meet increased prudential requirements that the Reserve Bank may legitimately impose on all banks, including Kiwibank, constitute a sale? Thirdly, if the board of New Zealand Post chooses to sell part of the business, maybe even part of Kiwibank operations, does this constitute a sale, particularly if it's a minority part of the Kiwibank's operations, or in fact it's a larger portion of the bank's operations? When does that constitute a sale? And what about the issue of issuing quasi-equity instruments, which hopefully Mr Clayton Cosgrove has a good feeling for, which such as, just to give him examples, I'm sure just to refresh his memory, convertible debt instruments, which are very common instruments in the capital markets. And in fact, I know back in April earlier this year, Kiwibank were in fact in the process of issuing another round of equity instruments to help fundraise and meet their ongoing debt financing requirements. So what I've done is just quoted 4 examples of where equity may legitimately be issued or sold, and does that constitute a sale? And this is obviously something that this bill would need to seriously address, and I don't think it does. But the next question for me is, why stop here? We own numerous SOEs. And so what's so special about Kiwibank? Why not, for example, Landcorp? I'm surprised that the member hasn't put that up. And
don't give them ideas.
And if we were to propose Landcorp as an example, I do note that the Assistant Speaker made a very important speech back in October 2007, when even he acknowledged that selling land, farms that Landcorp owned, were actually a legitimate part of their business. So it's, again, a similar example that I used with the Kiwibank. It may be Kiwibank may actually want to sell down part of its operations, so we've got a corollary there. And I just don't understand what makes Kiwibank so special for the opposition. The third thing, why should we be impeding New Zealand Post? And I note in New Zealand Post's recent profit announcement that it actually achieved a profit of $135 million. This is reported very recently. But of particular interest to me was that of that $143 million, actually, $46 million came from the sale of its Australian business. Again, you know, here we've got this entity, New Zealand Post, which includes Kiwibank, and here we are just in the last few months, New Zealand Post has been selling down some of its operations, and of course everyone is very happy that New Zealand Post is making a profit. And finally, I can't understand why we're imposing this rigorous test of 75% majority of this House to approve such a sale. It's an extraordinary test, and my colleague, Mr Chris Bishop, was talking to about this before. Why should this be contemplated? Why is such a test required, which is even more onerous than passing bills through this House? That's what I fail to grasp. And finally, I'd have to say, if we were to pass this bill, what does it imply for the governance structure of New Zealand Post? I think for anyone sitting on that board to have that inflexibility cuts across the whole role of governance in New Zealand Post and perhaps would impede the ability of directors.
He's destroyed it in 5 minutes.